The studio lights blazed overhead, casting a sharp glare on the polished stage of one of America's most watched talk shows. The anticipation in the air was almost tangible as J.D. Vance, the newly inaugurated vice president, strode onto the set with the composed demeanor of a man who had faced scrutiny before. Fresh from taking his oath of office, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. The audience clapped politely, though there was an underlying tension in the room, a sense that this wouldn't be just another routine interview. Marcus Bennett, the host, sat waiting, his smile practiced but tight, his fingers gripping the edge of his cue cards a little too firmly. Known for his sharp tongue and his clear bias, Bennett had built a reputation on cornering politicians, using his platform not just for discussion, but for spectacle. His producer had assured Vance's team that the conversation would remain professional, but one glance at the glint in Bennett's eyes told J.D. otherwise. This was an ambush, and every instinct from his Marine Corps training signaled that he was walking straight into a battlefield disguised as a television studio. The pleasantries were rushed, almost mechanical, as Bennett wasted no time setting the tone. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice dripping with artificial warmth, "let's talk about your remarkable journey, from a vocal Trump critic to now serving as his second in command." The question was a baited hook, meant to frame Vance's political evolution as opportunistic rather than principled. J.D. met his gaze unflinching, his expression calm but unreadable. "You know, Marcus," he replied smoothly, "that's actually a perfect place to start, because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." A flicker of surprise crossed Bennett's face. This wasn't the defensive response he had expected. He had been prepared for evasion, for talking points, but instead Vance leaned into the topic, meeting the challenge head-on. The audience leaned forward slightly, sensing the tension building beneath the surface. Bennett adjusted his position, shifting in his chair as he prepared his follow-up. "Growth and understanding," he repeated, his tone carrying a hint of mockery. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because some might say it's more about political convenience." His grip on the cue cards tightened slightly, the subtle tell of a man looking for control. J.D., however, remained steady, unshaken. "You see, Marcus," he said, his voice even and deliberate, "in America we have this incredible tradition of being able to change our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized President Trump years ago, I was looking at things through a narrow lens. But then I saw something remarkable. I saw how his policies were actually helping the very people I wrote about in my book. And that made me take a step back and rethink my assumptions." Bennett's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He had expected J.D. to stumble, to hesitate, but instead the vice president had turned the moment into a discussion about open-mindedness rather than contradiction. Before Bennett could steer the conversation back to his intended narrative, J.D. leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you something, Marcus," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at evidence and realized your initial judgment might have been wrong?" The pause that followed was a fraction too long. Bennett's polished composure faltered for just a moment before he forced a smile. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, not mine." He shuffled his cue cards, eager to move to his next planned attack. J.D. leaned back in his chair, a knowing glint in his eye. The game had begun, but it was already clear that it wasn't going to play out the way Bennett had intended. Bennett's grip on his cue cards tightened as he tried to regain control of the conversation, his polished facade masking the growing frustration beneath. He had come prepared to expose J.D. Vance as a political opportunist, to corner him into an admission of contradiction. But instead, the vice president had flipped the script, turning the discussion into a lesson on growth rather than inconsistency. Refusing to be outmaneuvered, Bennett adjusted in his chair, his smirk returning as he prepared his next line of attack. "Growth and understanding," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air with an edge of skepticism. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because some might say your change of heart was less about understanding and more about political convenience." The audience reacted with a quiet murmur, sensing the tension rising between the two men. Vance, however, remained composed, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his expression unshaken. "Marcus," he said calmly, "in America we pride ourselves on learning from experience. If leaders never evolved, never reconsidered their positions, we wouldn't have progress. We'd have stagnation. When I first criticized President Trump, I did so without fully understanding the impact of his policies. But then, I saw real results. Factories reopening, families getting relief, communities that had been ignored for decades finally being heard. That's not political convenience. That's learning." Bennett didn't hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. "So what you're saying is that your criticisms of Trump in the past were just ignorance? That you simply didn't know better?" Vance didn't blink. "What I'm saying is that, like any thinking person, I adjusted my views when presented with evidence. Isn't that what we ask of leaders? To acknowledge when they were wrong and make decisions based on facts rather than pride?" The audience murmured again, this time more approvingly, and Bennett quickly cut in before the momentum could shift further in Vance's favor. "That's convenient," he said, forcing a chuckle. "But it does beg the question, if you were wrong then, what's to say you're not wrong now? How can the American people trust someone whose views have changed so drastically?" Vance tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely considering the question. "Because trust isn't built on never changing, it's built on honesty. And I'd rather be a leader who admits when he's learned something new than one who doubles down on a mistake just to avoid criticism. The real question, Marcus, is whether we punish people for growth or celebrate it." Bennett's jaw tightened for the briefest second before he forced another smile. "That's an interesting way to frame it," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "But let's talk about something else. Your loyalty to President Trump. Some might say that your shift in support isn't about growth at all, but about aligning yourself with power. That you saw which way the wind was blowing and decided to follow it." Vance smiled slightly, but there was an edge to it, a quiet confidence that suggested he had been expecting exactly this line of attack. "Let's talk about loyalty then," he said, his voice steady. "Because in Washington people like to throw that word around as if it's a weakness. But where I come from, loyalty is about standing with those who deliver results, not just those who are popular. And when I saw firsthand how President Trump was helping the very people I grew up with, I didn't see an opportunity, I saw a responsibility. If recognizing good leadership and supporting it means following the wind, then maybe more politicians should start paying attention to which way it's blowing." Bennett opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Vance leaned in slightly, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "But let me ask you, Marcus, have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever reconsidered a position based on what you've seen with your own eyes?" The question landed like a stone in water, rippling through the studio. Bennett hesitated, the briefest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he forced a dismissive chuckle. "We're not here to talk about me," he deflected, shuffling his cue cards. "We're here to talk about you." Vance leaned back again, a knowing glint in his eyes. "That's what I thought," he said simply. The audience chuckled, a few quiet claps echoing from the back of the room. Bennett's carefully constructed ambush was unraveling faster than he had anticipated, and for the first time that evening it was clear he wasn't the one in control. Bennett's frustration was beginning to show, but he wasn't ready to back down just yet. He shuffled his cue cards, searching for the next pressure point, and then his lips curled into a knowing smirk. If attacking J.D. Vance's political transformation wasn't shaking him, then perhaps it was time to step onto more volatile ground. Faith. He straightened in his chair and adopted a tone of measured concern. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "Let's talk about your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mixing of church and state?" A few murmurs rippled through the audience, and Vance immediately recognized the strategy. Frame him as a religious zealot, out of touch with the modern world. But instead of recoiling, he leaned in slightly, his expression calm but firm. "Divine guidance, Marcus?" he echoed, letting the words settle before continuing. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith, they were afraid of tyranny." A few quiet amens came from the audience, and Bennett's smirk faltered just slightly. But he pressed on, unwilling to let Vance control the narrative. "Surely in our modern diverse society," he interjected, "we have to be careful about enforcing religious beliefs on the government." Vance raised his hand slightly, signaling for the chance to finish his thought. His tone remained respectful, but there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it. "Let me be very clear, Marcus," he said. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, the same way leaders have done throughout our nation's history. Not because we are establishing a state religion, but because we understand that our rights come from God, not from government." The audience stirred, a mixture of nods and murmured agreement. Bennett's expression tightened, realizing that his attempt to frame Vance as an extremist was slipping through his fingers. Glancing toward his producer, who was watching anxiously from the sidelines, Bennett knew he needed to regain control. He adopted a more skeptical tone, tilting his head slightly. "So, are you saying that your policies are directly influenced by your faith? What about those who don't share your religious beliefs? Should they be concerned?" Vance met his gaze without hesitation. "Marcus, let me ask you something. When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. Nobody complained when we prayed before missions. Because in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understand that there's something bigger than politics. That faith in its truest form isn't about division. It's about purpose, about having a moral foundation." The weight of his words hung in the air, and even those in the audience who might not have shared his beliefs seemed to be listening a little more closely. Bennett's jaw tightened as he attempted to pivot. "Let's move on to your relationship with President Trump," he said hastily, but the damage had already been done. Vance had taken what was meant to be a trap and turned it into an unapologetic defense of faith as a cornerstone of leadership. His presence remained unwavering, his voice calm but resolute, and as the conversation moved forward, it became clear this was no ordinary interview. This was a moment that no one in that studio, or the millions watching at home, would soon forget. Bennett's attempt to discredit J.D. Vance's faith had failed to shake him, and now he was scrambling to regain control of the interview. He needed to pivot, to steer the conversation into a realm where he felt he had the upper hand. Straightening his posture, he adopted a more analytical tone. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice measured but edged with condescension, "let's discuss your unwavering loyalty to President Trump. Some would argue that your dramatic shift in opinion isn't about growth or learning, but about power, that you saw which way the political winds were blowing and decided to follow them. How do you respond to those who say your alignment with the president is less about conviction and more about ambition?" The question was meant to corner Vance, to cast doubt on his integrity. But Vance had expected this attack. He took a breath, his expression unshaken, and then leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and deliberate. "You know, Marcus," he said, "it's interesting that people like you only ever question loyalty when it's directed at someone you don't support. But let's talk about what loyalty really means." Bennett arched an eyebrow, sensing that Vance was taking control of the narrative, but he remained silent, allowing him to continue. "In Washington," Vance said, "loyalty is treated like a weakness, something to be mocked or dismissed. But where I come from, loyalty is about standing by people who deliver results. It's about recognizing when a leader is actually making a difference instead of just talking about it. When I saw firsthand how President Trump's policies were helping the very communities I grew up in, I didn't see an opportunity, I saw a responsibility. If recognizing real leadership and supporting it means following the wind, then maybe more politicians should start paying attention to which way it's blowing." The audience responded with quiet murmurs of approval, and for the first time, Bennett's carefully constructed smirk flickered with unease. Still, he wasn't ready to concede. "But surely," he pressed, "someone as educated as you, someone who has studied law at Yale, must see the contradiction in supporting a man you once criticized so harshly." Vance smiled slightly, as if amused by the predictability of the question. "Marcus," he said, his tone calm but pointed, "you seem very focused on trying to find contradictions in my past, but you're missing the bigger picture. The real contradiction would be ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes just to please critics like yourself. Growth isn't hypocrisy, it's wisdom. Bennett opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Vance continued, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. But since we're talking about contradictions, he added, let's discuss something I've noticed. How some in the media seem far more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families. Why is that, Marcus? The studio grew remarkably quiet, the usual rhythm of back-and-forth interruptions suddenly absent. Bennett blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He shuffled his cue cards, clearly searching for a way to deflect, but Vance wasn't finished. Let's talk about what's actually happening in our communities instead of playing rhetorical games, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had no interest in political theater. Because while we sit here debating whether or not my beliefs are convenient, there are families struggling to put food on the table, workers watching their jobs disappear, and communities being hollowed out. Maybe that's a better use of our time, don't you think? Bennett's carefully composed demeanor was beginning to crack. He had entered this interview expecting to be the one asking the hard-hitting questions, the one setting the pace. Instead, Vance had flipped the dynamic entirely, exposing not only the bias of the media, but also its unwillingness to engage in substantive discussions that mattered to real Americans. The tension in the room was palpable, and as Bennett glanced toward his producer for guidance, it was clear to everyone watching, this interview was no longer under his control. Bennett knew he was losing ground. The usual tactics, framing J.D. Vance as a hypocrite, questioning his faith, and attacking his loyalty to President Trump, had failed to rattle him. The audience wasn't siding with the host's relentless attempts to trip him up. Instead, they were drawn to Vance's measured responses, his unshakable demeanor, and his ability to turn every attack into a moment of conviction. But Bennett wasn't finished yet. If political opportunism and faith couldn't discredit Vance, perhaps he could strike at something deeper. His identity. He straightened in his chair, glancing at his notes before delivering his next blow. Mr. Vice President, he began, his tone sharp but deliberate, you've built your reputation on being a voice for working-class Americans. You wrote an entire book about growing up in hardship, about struggling to get ahead, and yet, here you are, sitting in the halls of power, defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony? The words were carefully crafted, meant to paint Vance as someone who had abandoned his roots, who had climbed the ladder and then pulled it up behind him. Vance, however, remained unfazed. He exhaled slightly, almost as if he found the question predictable, and then met Bennett's gaze with quiet intensity. That's interesting, Marcus, he said, his voice calm but firm. Because, where I come from, we don't judge people by the price of their suit, but by the content of their character. The audience stirred, sensing that Vance was about to turn the moment into something much larger than the trap Bennett had laid for him. You see, Marcus, he continued, I was raised by a grandmother who worked hard every single day of her life. She taught me that success isn't something to be ashamed of, it's something to be grateful for. She didn't raise me to resent people who made something of themselves. She raised me to learn from them. Bennett shifted in his seat, trying to find a crack in Vance's composure. So, are you saying that working-class Americans should just accept that the people in power have their best interests at heart? He challenged. That they should blindly trust that a billionaire businessman understands their struggles? Vance shook his head slightly, offering a small smirk that suggested he had been expecting this exact question. No, Marcus, I'm saying that working-class Americans don't need journalists like you to tell them what to think, he shot back. I grew up in the kind of places where people don't waste their time complaining about who has money and who doesn't. They care about results. They care about whether their jobs are coming back, whether their kids have a future, whether their leaders actually listen to them instead of lecturing them. And that's exactly why I support President Trump. Because I saw with my own eyes how his policies were helping the very people I grew up with. Bennett's lips tightened, but he refused to let go. But doesn't it concern you, he pressed, that you were once outspoken in your criticism of him, and now you're defending him so fiercely? If nothing else, doesn't that make people question your sincerity? Vance leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Marcus, what concerns me is that people like you think it's a scandal when someone changes their mind based on experience, he said. I didn't change my values. I changed my perspective. And the only people who seem to have a problem with that are those who would rather I stick to an outdated opinion just to make them feel better. The audience reacted with quiet applause, a sign that they were beginning to see through the game Bennett was playing. The host, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. He adjusted his posture, eyes narrowing as he prepared for one last attempt to paint Vance as a sellout. "So you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition?" he asked, his voice edged with skepticism. "That none of this was about power?" Vance didn't hesitate. "I'm saying that unlike some folks in the media, I don't measure success by how many people I can please," he replied, his voice unwavering. "I measure it by whether I'm staying true to the principles I was raised with." The words hung in the air for a moment, thick with finality, and for the first time that evening, Marcus Bennett looked like a man who had run out of moves. Bennett was running out of options, and it showed. His questions had been carefully designed to undermine J.D. Vance, to expose him as a political opportunist, a hypocrite, or, at the very least, someone who had abandoned his roots for power. But none of it was landing the way he had expected. Instead of dodging or becoming defensive, Vance had met every accusation with calm clarity, flipping each attack into a statement of principle that resonated with the audience. The tide was shifting, and Bennett knew it. His usual tactics, cutting interruptions, sharp jabs, and smug dismissals, weren't working. He needed something more. He glanced at his notes, fingers gripping his cue cards a little too tightly, and then exhaled. If he couldn't shake Vance with policy or character attacks, perhaps he could corner him with raw cynicism. "Mr. Vice President," he began again, forcing a chuckle that sounded more strained than natural, "you've painted yourself as a man of conviction, a leader who stands by his principles. But let's be honest, power changes people. You came from a working-class background, but now you wear expensive suits, dine with billionaires, and sit in the highest offices of government. Can you really look into this camera and tell the American people that you're still one of them?" He leaned back slightly, as if convinced that this was the question that would finally unsettle Vance, finally make him stumble. But Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even hesitate. "Marcus," he said, his voice even, measured, "where I come from, we don't define a person's character by the clothes they wear. We judge them by the way they live their lives, by whether they keep their word, and by whether they remember where they came from." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing, "And I remember exactly where I came from. I remember what it felt like to watch factories close, to see families struggle, to wonder if there was any future for people like us. And I also remember what it felt like to see those same people finally have hope again, not because of speeches or promises, but because of actual policies that put them first." Bennett's smile faltered, but he pressed on. "But isn't it a little convenient," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "that you realized all of this just in time for a political career? That your growth just so happened to align with an opportunity to serve as Trump's running mate?" His tone was laced with insinuation, the implication clear. Vance's change of heart wasn't about conviction, but about ambition. Vance leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Bennett in a way that made the host shift uncomfortably. "Marcus, I know you'd like to believe that everyone in politics operates the way the media expects them to, calculating every move, shaping every decision based on what's most convenient," he said. "But where I come from, we don't change our beliefs to fit the moment. We change our minds when we see the truth." He tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, Marcus, have you ever changed your mind about something important? Or is the only acceptable kind of change the one that fits your worldview?" The audience murmured, sensing that the balance of power had once again shifted. Bennett hesitated, his polished exterior cracking for just a second before he scoffed. "We're not here to talk about me," he muttered, shuffling his papers again. "That's what I thought," Vance said simply, leaning back in his chair. His voice wasn't triumphant, wasn't smug, just calm, unwavering, and completely in control. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone watching, Bennett wasn't the one leading this interview anymore. Bennett was losing control, and J.D. Vance knew it. Every carefully laid trap had failed. Every attempt to paint him as an opportunist, a hypocrite, or a man out of touch with his roots had only made him seem more steadfast, more resolute. The audience could feel it too, the shift in power, the unraveling of what was supposed to be a takedown but had turned into a masterclass in composure. Bennett, still clinging to the illusion of authority, shuffled his cue cards again, his jaw tightening as he grasped for a new angle. If policy attacks and personal accusations couldn't shake Vance, perhaps it was time for pure ridicule. He forced a smirk, leaning forward slightly, as if letting his next words land with extra weight. "Mr. Vice President," he said, his voice laced with mock concern, "you speak a lot about loyalty, about faith, about standing firm in your beliefs. But let's be real. You once called Trump unfit for office, and now you're his most loyal defender. You once spoke against him, and now you serve him. Some might say that's not principle, it's submission." The word hung in the air like a challenge, and a few murmurs rippled through the audience. Vance, however, didn't even blink. Instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough to make Bennett uncomfortable before answering. "You know, Marcus," he said, his voice steady, "it's fascinating how you and so many in the media always frame loyalty as a weakness when it applies to people you don't like." Bennett's smirk faded slightly, and Vance continued, his tone firm but measured. "When a Democrat changes their mind, they're evolving. When a Republican does it, they're selling out. When a liberal stands by their allies, it's integrity. When a conservative does it, it's submission. Don't you think that's just a little bit hypocritical?" Bennett's lips tightened, but Vance wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto the host's. "You see, Marcus, I've watched the way your network covers politicians. I've seen the way you treat leaders who hold traditional values. If they dare to talk about faith, they're forcing religion on the country. If they speak about patriotism, they're dangerously nationalistic. But when a liberal does the same thing, suddenly it's noble, it's enlightened. So tell me, why is it that when I support the president, it's blind obedience, but when you support your preferred politicians, it's just being a good journalist?" The audience erupted in applause, and for the first time all evening, Bennett had no immediate response. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his fingers tightening around his notes as he glanced briefly at his producer, who was now watching with thinly veiled frustration. Vance let the reaction settle before continuing. "The truth is, Marcus, the media doesn't have a problem with loyalty. It has a problem with the wrong people being loyal. You don't care that I changed my mind. You care that I didn't change it the way you wanted me to." Bennett shifted, clearing his throat, but the usual confidence in his demeanor had cracked. Vance had turned the moment on its head, stripping away the illusion of journalistic objectivity and exposing the double standard for everyone to see. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore, they were watching a reckoning. Bennett could feel the momentum slipping further from his grasp, but he wasn't done yet. If J.D. Vance had managed to parry every political attack and turn the tables on media hypocrisy, then perhaps the most effective tactic left was to go after something deeper: faith and tradition. He straightened in his chair, masking his frustration with a carefully crafted air of skepticism. "Mr. Vice President," he began, tilting his head slightly as if contemplating his next words, "you've spoken extensively about faith, family, and traditional values. But let's be honest, we live in a diverse and evolving society. Some might say your views are outdated, even exclusionary. Do you really believe that a country as modern as ours should be clinging to these so-called traditional values?" The question was carefully worded, designed to frame Vance as someone out of touch with the times, as if faith, morality, and patriotism were relics of the past. Vance didn't hesitate. He sat up slightly, his expression composed, his voice steady. "Marcus, let me ask you something," he said, his tone almost conversational. "When exactly did faith and family become controversial? When did believing in hard work, responsibility, and love of country become something to apologize for?" The audience shifted, sensing the weight of his words. Bennett gave a tight-lipped smile, clearly unimpressed. "It's not about controversy," he countered quickly. "It's about progress. Some would argue that clinging to old traditions holds us back." Vance nodded, as if he had expected the response. "That's the difference between us, Marcus," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "You see faith as something restrictive. I see it as something that gives people strength. You see tradition as something to be discarded. I see it as the foundation that built this country." He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. "The values I talk about, faith, family, hard work, these aren't just slogans. These are the very things that have held communities together through hardship, through wars, through economic crises. You call them outdated, I call them essential." Bennett exhaled sharply through his nose, sensing he was losing his grip on the narrative. "But surely," he interjected, "in a pluralistic society, you must acknowledge that not everyone shares your religious beliefs. Shouldn't government remain neutral instead of embracing faith-based values?" Vance leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Marcus, when I was a Marine, we had chaplains on the battlefield. Nobody questioned their presence, nobody scoffed when we prayed before missions. Because in those moments, even the skeptics understood that some things are bigger than politics. The founders of this nation didn't fear faith, they feared a government that believed it had the power to replace it. That's why our Constitution protects religious freedom, not to silence people of faith, but to ensure that no government can dictate what we believe." A few members of the audience clapped softly, the message resonating beyond the ideological walls Bennett had tried to build. The host's face twitched, his fingers tapping lightly against his cue cards. He had wanted to frame Vance as a relic of the past, but instead Vance had made it clear faith and tradition weren't fading, they were enduring, and no amount of media cynicism was going to change that. Bennett was out of moves, and he knew it. Every angle he had taken, political inconsistency, loyalty to Trump, working-class authenticity, faith, and tradition, had been met with unwavering composure, sharp intellect, and an ability to turn the conversation back on him. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He straightened his shoulders, his jaw tightening as he clung to one last desperate attempt to regain control. He glanced at his cue cards, then back at Vance, his tone taking on a forced air of authority. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice sharp, "let's address the elephant in the room. Some say you've completely reinvented yourself, not just in your political views, but in your entire identity. You once criticized Trump, and now you praise him. You once claimed to be an outsider, and now you sit at the highest levels of government. You once wrote about the struggles of the working class, and now you defend a billionaire. How do you expect the American people to trust you when it seems like you've become everything you used to stand against?" The audience murmured, sensing the weight of the moment. This was it, Bennett's last play, his final attempt to force Vance into an admission of hypocrisy. Vance didn't flinch. He took a measured breath, allowing a small pause before speaking. "Marcus," he said, his voice even, his gaze locked onto the journalist, "where I come from, we don't measure a man's integrity by whether he stays the same his whole life. We measure it by whether he's willing to admit when he was wrong and stand by what he believes, even when it's not easy." He leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "You call it reinvention. I call it growth. You call it contradiction. I call it learning. The American people don't want leaders who are too proud to admit when they've changed their minds. They want leaders who are honest enough to say, 'I saw something different, and I learned from it.'" Bennett's smirk faltered. He had expected Vance to be defensive, to stumble, to try to justify himself with polished political rhetoric. But instead, Vance was owning it, stripping the attack of its power. And then, with perfect timing, he flipped the narrative once more. "But, since you bring up trust, Marcus," he continued, his voice growing firmer, "let's talk about something the American people actually don't trust. Your industry. Let's talk about the fact that millions of hard-working Americans don't believe the media represents them anymore. Let's talk about why people turn off their televisions when journalists like you try to tell them what to think instead of reporting the truth." The studio went silent. Bennett's carefully constructed facade cracked, his fingers tightening around his cue cards as if they could anchor him in a moment that was slipping away. He opened his mouth to interject, but Vance wasn't done. "You call me a contradiction because I changed my mind after seeing real results," he said, his voice unwavering. "But what about you, Marcus? What about the media? When was the last time you admitted you were wrong? When was the last time you questioned your own biases, instead of assuming everyone else is the problem?" Bennett's face turned slightly red, his composure crumbling under the weight of a question he couldn't answer. The audience was no longer just watching a political debate. They were watching a reckoning. Vance had not only dismantled the attack on his integrity, but he had turned the lens back on the very institution that had tried to discredit him. Bennett, the seasoned journalist, the master of hard-hitting questions, now sat exposed, floundering for control in an interview that had slipped completely from his grasp. As the interview reached its final moments, J.D. Vance stood poised, his presence calm and resolute, while Bennett, visibly rattled, seemed to struggle to regain control of the situation. The usual rapid-fire questioning had been replaced with an uncomfortable silence, the kind that often follows when a well-calculated narrative begins to unravel. Bennett glanced nervously at his notes, but Vance wasn't waiting for a cue to wrap things up. He had seized the moment, turned the tables, and now, with quiet authority, he was ready to deliver his final message. "Marcus," he began, his voice firm yet composed, "what you and so many others in your industry fail to understand is that real integrity isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to admit when you were wrong, to learn from your experiences, and to stay true to your principles despite the pressures to conform." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, making sure every word landed. "The American people are tired of being told what to think, of being lectured by those who think they know what's best for them. They're tired of being labeled for their faith, their values, and their love for their country. They're tired of journalists who, instead of asking questions, use their platforms to shape narratives and tear people down." Vance's words carried the weight of his convictions, and his voice grew even more resolute. This isn't just about one interview. It's about the broader contempt that some in the media have for ordinary Americans. You see, Marcus, these are the same people who love their country, who go to church every Sunday, who work hard to provide for their families, and when people like me speak up for them, when we acknowledge their struggles, we get mocked. But you know what? I'm not backing down. I'm proud of where I come from, I'm proud of what I believe in, and I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump. The finality in his words was unmistakable. The audience, who had been quietly observing, now erupted in applause, a powerful show of support for Vance's unapologetic stance. Bennett, flustered and speechless, had no more questions, no more ammunition. Vance had not only dismantled his carefully planned interview, but had turned it into a victory, one that exposed the bias and arrogance of the media while reaffirming his own unshakable principles. "The truth is, Marcus," Vance concluded, his voice carrying a final note of conviction, "this country was built on the values that you and your colleagues mock, and no matter how hard you try to undermine those values, they will continue to guide us forward." With that, he stood, nodding politely to the host, and left the stage, his message clear. Faith, family, and freedom weren't just words. They were the foundation of everything that mattered. One of the key lessons from this story is the value of integrity and staying true to one's principles, even in the face of criticism. J.D. Vance's ability to stand firm in his beliefs and admit when he has changed his mind shows the importance of personal growth. For many older adults who have witnessed decades of political and social changes, this lesson is especially powerful. It's a reminder that true wisdom doesn't come from sticking rigidly to old views, but from the courage to learn, adapt, and evolve based on new experiences. This can be particularly comforting for those who may feel that their best years are behind them. Growth doesn't stop with age, and it's never too late to embrace change. Another important takeaway is the power of faith and tradition in providing stability during difficult times. In a world that often seems to be in flux, having a strong foundation in values like family, faith, and loyalty can help navigate life's challenges. For seniors, these values are not just abstract ideas. They are the bedrock of a fulfilling life, shaping how we interact with others and approach adversity. The story highlights how these timeless values continue to guide us, no matter how much society changes around us. It encourages older generations to take pride in their belief systems, knowing that their experiences have endowed them with wisdom that can positively influence those around them. Lastly, this story reminds us that integrity and loyalty are not weaknesses but strengths. In the modern world, where cynicism can often overshadow trust, it's essential to remember that staying true to what we believe, even when others disagree, is a form of strength, not submission. This message resonates deeply with anyone who has seen the ups and downs of life. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply being true to oneself.